Now, just a little warning here at the start that there will be spoilers for the latest episode of Wandavision in this video, which is the 6th episode. So if you have not seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it's a really good time to click away. Okay, so right at the top, let me say that this was yet another very enjoyable episode. I love that each one just leaves me wanting more and waiting for next week. I love how it gives you just enough pieces of the puzzle each time to keep you hooked, yet not so many that everything suddenly becomes clear and easy to figure out. It's walking that fine line between giving too much and too little perfectly, and somehow, no matter what the genre or the format, Marvel always just seems to find a way to tell a great story, and WandaVision has been no different. That said, to me all the little hints and clues we got this week keep pointing to Wanda, and Wanda alone being the one behind it all. And I know, there are a lot of great theories out there that say otherwise. I read some great ones every week in the comments of these reviews, and I think to myself, yeah, maybe you're onto something and maybe I'm dead wrong. And make no mistake here, I'd be happy to be wrong about all this. I don't do this to be right, I do it to discuss, and I'd be happy to see a character like Mephisto behind it all, or for it to be something no one has predicted, something that blows my mind because I, or anyone else, never saw it coming. And certainly there are some interesting clues that point in some pretty curious possible directions here. There are things that certainly seem to point to, again, Mephisto being behind it all. But we do have to ask ourselves if they're intended to be clues or not, because though I think many things in the show are very deliberate or have some sort of double meaning or are meant to cleverly hint at or imply something, I don't think, in fact I know, that not literally everything is. I learned this lesson pretty well, or the hard way, after analyzing and making theory videos after The Force Awakens. And no, I probably shouldn't compare the two because there was no real plan with the sequels. Everything in Episode 7 was a mystery box without definitive answers within. Whereas with this show, there is obviously plenty of planning, and again, certain things are deliberately meant to be a clue. Not to mention, on the flip side, some things may be trying to deliberately lead you down the wrong path or line of thinking, or they may even unintentionally be doing that as you look for and or think you find a clue where one is not intended. One way or the other, though, I think it'd only be fitting somehow if this show, where the main character essentially wields a type of magic, ends up being where we're being distracted by what one hand is doing, all the while we fail to see what the other hand is doing. That we're missing what's really going on here and purposely being led astray, that we ourselves are falling for the trick as well, which I guess could be an argument for or against there being something much bigger going on here behind the scenes, which is what I'm enjoying about this show. It makes you overthink or outthink yourself at times. And one of the best examples of this just might be Agnes's husband Ralph, who we have yet to see in the show. Now there's that part of you that thinks, well, he's been mentioned too many times by Agnes to not be important, yet at the same time, in a lot of these old shows, the neighbors were a bit of a quirky couple, where maybe one spouse constantly makes a crack about the other one, and so it could all end up being nothing more than a sort of homage to that, and either intended or not intended to be a distraction. Because, and not to get too far off topic, but as someone who has played a lot of D&D in their life and almost always been a dungeon master, I can tell you firsthand that you just never know what random story detail a player or players are going to latch onto and think is very important, even if it's not important at all. I've literally and recently had players spend 20-some minutes arguing over whether or not to eat some soup at an inn just because I had first pointed out that the soup smelled good and everyone in the inn seemed to be really enjoying it. They then assumed this meant something was wrong with the soup, that I wouldn't have pointed that out if it wasn't meant to be a clue that the soup was poisoned and would end up charming them or something like that if they ate it. When in reality, it was just soup and I was trying to add a little flavor to the game by pointing out how good it smelled. And finally, to end their argument, I had to break down and say out of game, it's just effing soup. Which one of them thought was further part of the plot to trick them into eating the soup, no joke. And so anyway, my point is that Ralph could just be Ralph, the quirky neighbor's husband who she jokes about to get a laugh from the audience. Or, yeah, he could also be the literal devil, which again is part of what I'm enjoying, trying to figure out what's relevant and what's not, because I used to think Agnes herself may be something important, but I'm all but ready to remove her from my list of suspects after this episode, or my list of people who might be more than meets the eye. I'm really starting to think she was just a random woman living in this town who just so happened to be picked by Wanda to be her neighbor and to co-star in the show, if you will. And I think on some level she knows what's going on, as does Herb, who at one point in this episode asked Wanda, "Do you want something to change?" But anyway, the whole Agnes being in her car sort of lost and confused, or looking like she was malfunctioning really, says to me she's at the mercy of Wanda the same as everyone else. And we also saw in this episode that some people don't get such an important part to play in the show, that the further away from the center of the town it seems, the more likely you are to just be a sort of prop. And by the tear in the eye of one of them that we saw, they do seem to be aware to some degree of what's going on and are in pain. And we've also had that confirmed before. We know that the people of the town are in pain. They're not just blank slates going through this. And since Wanda seems to be aware of this, aware of what she's doing to these people, her brother even talks about it at one point, well, to me, again, it says this is all just Wanda, and she's really being set up to become maybe some sort of villain. I mean, it's getting harder and harder to have sympathy for her when she's aware of all the harm she's doing to these innocent people, and yet you do still want to feel bad for her because, as she basically said, she was lost after Vision died. And then speaking of her brother Pietro, he seems to be completely aware of what she's doing and what's going on. He even seems to compliment her on it at one point during their big talk towards the end of the episode, saying how she kept families intact and kept personalities the same, and even gave people better jobs. He then asks her how she even did all this, which is when Wanda's accent returns, curiously enough. Because, as I've said in previous reviews, it leads me to believe there's some sort of split personality thing going on for her to deal with the pain. That part of Wanda is in control and enchanting another part of her with this perfect little life, keeping her in blissful ignorance. Either way, she goes on to say that she doesn't know how she got these new powers, and she is powerful now, and it seems to be very much her power. At the end, we even see Wanda expand the Hex not only to sort of reabsorb Vision, who was trying to leave, and he even lies to Wanda in this episode in order to go investigating, and does of course discover the border and tries to leave, as I just said. But anyway, Wanda ends up doing more than reabsorbing the wayward Vision. She also brings in all or most of the Sword agents, other than the few that get away, and we see their base of operations, and all these agents sort of get turned into a circus type setting, and clowns. Also getting brought in was Darcy, and we'll have to wait and see who or what she gets turned into, and how much, if anything, she remembers. Along with all this, we also learn that leaving and entering the Hex literally changes people's molecular structure, that it's done this with Monica Rambeau, which makes me wonder if this is how we'll bring mutants into the MCU. Will this somehow end with her expanding the Hex across the world, changing all sorts of realities and mutating people, a sort of reverse House of M, as I've speculated before? Now, it sounds like a bit too much, but who knows at this point how it'll all end, and I'm glad I have no real idea how it'll all end. Also in this episode, thanks to Darcy's digging, we learn about something or some kind of weapons program called Operation Cataract that Director Hayward seems to be a part of, and was likely using Vision as part of this as well, which I think also sort of clears Hayward from being more than meets the eye, that he's not Mephisto as some people have suggested or theorized. Instead, he's just your usual sort of shady government agent who is a part of a dark or clandestine program, though what exactly that program is doing is a really good question. We know that a cataract is basically the clouding of the vision, and assuming the name of the operation has something to do with its intent or purpose, which I think it does, I do think this is meant to be a pretty big clue. I think the most obvious answer is, again, it has something to do with Vision, something to do with turning him into a weapon. It's clouding Vision. On a bit of a different note then, I thought it was great to see all the characters in their original costumes, and we also saw that Wanda's kids, Billy and Tommy, have developed their powers, and even they were in their superhero outfits. And I'm really kind of curious to see what happens to the twins, considering they were essentially created entirely by Wanda. So all in all here, another episode that seemed to give us some answers while also keeping us completely guessing. And I have to say, it just keeps getting better and better. I find myself more and more excited for every new episode. And if I had to guess, I still think it's just Wanda doing this, though, as I said, I'm happy to be wrong about that. It just seems they're setting her up, again, to be some sort of villain here, that in the end she's going to be responsible for some sort of major change to the world and to the MCU itself, which most likely is bringing in the X-Men somehow. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think of the latest episode of WandaVision, and where you believe this is all heading. Do you think this is just Wanda, or is there much, much more going on still? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.